Hollywood has spent decades painting a very specific picture of the Eastern Front during the Second World War. You have likely seen the scenes where desperate Soviet conscripts are pushed out of train cars and thrown into the meat grinder of battle with nothing but raw courage. The famous myth dictates that one man gets a rifle and the other gets a clip of ammunition, waiting for his comrade to die so he can pick up the weapon and continue the charge. It is a story of incredible sacrifice and logistical poverty that perfectly frames the narrative of a seemingly endless tide of human waves crashing against the superior German war machine. But history is rarely as simple as a movie script. The terrifying truth of the Soviet military machine is not about a lack of rifles. They had millions of them. The true nightmare of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942 was not about the men charging forward with empty hands. It was about what was deliberately positioned directly behind those men, waiting in the mud and the snow to ensure that they never, ever stopped running forward. Today, we are going to tear apart the Hollywood myth of the unarmed Soviet soldier and expose the dark, mechanized reality of Order 227. We will dissect the catastrophic logistical collapse that left thousands of men stranded on the front line without their primary weapons, and more importantly, we will analyze the ruthless mechanical solution deployed by the Soviet High Command to prevent a total collapse of their armed forces. You are about to see how the most terrifying weapon on the battlefield was not pointed at the enemy, but at the backs of their own retreating soldiers. To understand this brutal reality, we must first look at the sheer scale of the logistical disaster that unfolded during Operation Fall Blau. By the summer of 1942, the Soviet Union was reeling from the devastating German offensives. The Red Army was mobilizing millions of raw conscripts from the deepest corners of the Soviet Empire. The industrial heartland had been physically dismantled and relocated thousands of miles to the east, beyond the Ural Mountains, where factories were churning out the legendary Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifles at an astonishing, unprecedented rate. The problem was not production. The problem was distribution. The Soviet railway network, the critical bloodline of the military infrastructure, was under constant, crippling bombardment by the German Luftwaffe. Massive trains loaded with thousands of freshly manufactured rifles, crates of ammunition, and vital winter gear were systematically hunted down and blown apart before they could ever reach the frontline depots near Stalingrad and the Volga River. As a result, a horrifying bottleneck emerged in the supply chain. Human beings were arriving at the front in staggering numbers, heavily outstripping the localized supply of small arms. Let us dive deeper into the mathematics of that logistical failure. The Soviet Union had over 5 million Mosin-Nagant rifles in circulation, but when a major rail hub fell, the localized shortage was absolute. You cannot fight a tank with a statistical average. You fight it with the steel in your hands, and for thousands, those hands were temporarily empty. The sheer velocity of the German blitzkrieg meant that the lines of engagement shifted faster than the horse-drawn supply carts could follow. When an artillery barrage wiped out a forward supply dump, or when a battalion was suddenly encircled, the reinforcements sent in to plug the gap often found themselves facing fully mechanized German panzer divisions with nothing but trench shovels, bayonets, or whatever weapons they could pry from the frozen hands of their fallen comrades. This was not a deliberate tactical doctrine of starving men of weapons. It was a catastrophic, system-wide failure of logistics operating under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Place yourself in the boots of a 19-year-old conscript in that frozen, apocalyptic wasteland. The physical deprivation is one thing, but the psychological terror is something entirely different. You are crouched in a muddy trench, clutching a wooden shovel, staring across a devastated landscape known as no man's land. Suddenly, the earth begins to shake as German armored vehicles advance. The air is instantly filled with the deafening ripping sound of the German MG-34 machine gun, a weapon capable of firing 900 rounds per minute. It is a mechanical saw that cuts through human flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. The human brain is simply not wired to march forward into a mathematically guaranteed slaughter without the means to defend itself. When faced with an overwhelming wall of industrialized firepower, the fundamental biological instinct to survive completely overrode military discipline. Panic is a highly contagious disease on the battlefield. When one unit breaks and runs, the fear spreads like a shockwave, causing entire battalions to abandon their positions, discard their heavy equipment, and flee eastward in a chaotic, disorganized mass. This mass route was not an act of cowardice, but a deeply human reaction to a mechanical nightmare. By late July, the Soviet High Command watched in horror as their front lines began to disintegrate, not just from enemy action, but from a catastrophic collapse of morale. Joseph Stalin realized that if this psychological hemorrhage was not stopped immediately, the Soviet Union would cease to exist. Appeals to patriotism were no longer working. Threats of court-martial meant nothing to men who expected to die in the next 5 minutes. A completely different kind of solution was required, a mechanical, ruthless anchor to hold the breaking wave of the Red Army in place. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227, famously known by its chilling core directive, "Not a single step back." This order fundamentally changed the architecture of the Soviet battlefield. It criminalized unauthorized retreat, branding anyone who fell back without explicit orders as a traitor, a coward, or a panic-monger. But Stalin knew that a piece of paper could not stop a terrified mob. To enforce the impossible, Order 227 mandated the immediate creation of the Zagrado Triad, the barrier troops. These were heavily armed, highly disciplined detachments placed directly in the rear of unsteady divisions. Their primary mission was incredibly simple and incredibly brutal. They were ordered to shoot panic-mongers and cowards on the spot, to execute anyone attempting to flee the front line, and to force the retreating masses to turn around and face the German guns. But the Soviet command did not arm these barrier detachments with simple bolt-action rifles. A standard rifle fires too slowly to stop a stampede of hundreds of desperate men. To build a wall of pure deterrence, they required the ultimate tool of mechanical suppression. They turned to 64 kilograms of water-cooled steel, a weapon of such sustained, ruthless firepower that its mere presence could freeze the blood of a retreating soldier. In the next segment, we will strip down the anatomy of this meat grinder, the legendary Maxim M1910 heavy machine gun, and reveal how its internal thermodynamics and uninterrupted firing mechanism were weaponized to conquer the human instinct of survival. To stop a terrified army of thousands from running away, words, speeches, and pieces of paper are completely useless. When human psychology breaks down under the crushing weight of artillery fire, you cannot rely on morale. You need a physical anchor. You need 64 kilograms of water-cooled steel, mounted on wheels, and armed with a mechanical firing pin that does not hesitate, does not feel pity, and never disobeys an order. Enter the Maxim M1910 heavy machine gun. To truly comprehend the horror of the barrier troops, we must strip down the anatomy of this specific weapon, because it was not just a gun, it was an industrialized meat grinder, specifically engineered for sustained, merciless slaughter. Let us break down the mechanical architecture of this nightmare. The Maxim M1910 is not a weapon you carry into an assault. Fully assembled on its iconic Sokolov wheeled mount and equipped with its thick steel gun shield, it weighs a staggering 64.3 kilograms. It is a stationary fortress, a defensive anchor designed to lock down a specific geometric sector of the battlefield. The genius, and the terror, of the Maxim lies in its recoil-operated firing mechanism. When a round is fired, the explosive force pushing the bullet forward generates an equal and opposite force backward. Instead of letting this energy hit the shooter's shoulder, Hiram Maxim's brilliant engineering harnessed this violent kinetic energy to eject the spent casing, pull the next round from the canvas belt, and cock the firing pin for the next shot. It is a self-sustaining cycle of mechanical violence that requires only one thing from the operator: keeping the trigger pressed. But firing hundreds of rounds a minute creates a catastrophic physical problem: friction and immense thermodynamic heat. A standard air-cooled barrel will quickly glow red-hot, warp, and melt if fired continuously, jamming the weapon and saving the lives of those on the receiving end. The Soviet High Command could not afford their weapons to jam when thousands of retreating men were rushing towards them. The solution was the heavy brass water jacket completely enclosing the barrel. This cylinder held 4 liters of liquid coolant. As the weapon fired and the steel barrel heated up, the thermal energy transferred to the water, eventually bringing it to a rolling boil. A steam hose attached to the top of the jacket directed the boiling vapor away from the gunner's line of sight. As long as the crew kept feeding ammunition belts into the receiver and pouring water, or even snow and urine in desperate situations, into the cooling jacket, the Maxim could sustain a cyclic rate of 600 rounds per minute, indefinitely. It was an engine of perpetual suppression. This thermodynamic capability was the critical engineering feature that made it the perfect tool for Order 227. It represented an uninterrupted wall of lead that could outlast the stamina of any retreating battalion. Now, let us map out the tactical geometry of how this fear was deployed. The Zagradot triad, or barrier detachments, did not stand shoulder to shoulder with the regular infantry. Their deployment was meticulously calculated to maximize psychological terror. They were positioned exactly 300 to 500 meters behind the chaotic front line. This distance was highly deliberate. It placed them out of the immediate range of standard German infantry rifles and grenades, allowing them to operate with cold, undisturbed precision. When a Soviet frontline unit broke, the retreating soldiers had to run back through this designated zone. The barrier troops would set up their Maxim guns in interlocking fields of fire, creating overlapping arcs of destruction. The thick steel shield on the front of the Sokolov mount protected the gunners from the desperate return fire of their own comrades. By positioning these mechanized fortresses at strategic choke points, the Soviet command effectively created a lethal kill box in the rear of their own army. If you ran forward, you faced the devastating, mechanized blitzkrieg of the German Wehrmacht. If you turned and ran backward, you ran headfirst into an impenetrable, geometrically perfect grid of friendly fire, sustained by thermodynamics and enforced by the merciless logic of state survival. Imagine the sheer acoustic terror of this environment. The battlefield is already a sensory overload of explosions, screaming, and the tearing sound of enemy fire. But for a retreating Soviet conscript, the most terrifying sound was the deep, rhythmic, thumping cadence of the Maxim gun echoing from the rear. It was a mechanical heartbeat that signaled the absolute end of any hope of escape. The visual impact was equally devastating. In the low light of dusk, or the grey haze of winter, every third or fourth bullet in the canvas belt was a tracer round. As the barrier troops opened fire, they did not always aim to kill immediately. Often, they would fire sustained warning bursts just inches over the heads of the fleeing masses. The sight of brilliant, burning red lines of tracer fire cutting through the air, completely blocking the path to safety, was a psychological weapon of unimaginable power. It physically manifested the words of Stalin's order, "Not a single step back." The tracer rounds drew a glowing boundary line in the dirt, a line that meant instant execution if crossed. The disparity in technology in this specific interaction is what makes the historical reality so much darker than the myth. The Hollywood image of a man picking up a dropped Mosin Nagant rifle implies a chaotic, organic struggle for survival against the enemy. But the reality of the barrier troops was a calculated, asymmetrical execution. A disorganized, terrified mob of conscripts, many of whom had discarded their weapons to run faster, were going up against highly trained, well-fed, internal security forces operating crew-served, heavy support weapons. There was no battle to be fought here. It was an industrial harvest. The Maxim M1910, with its relentless cyclic rate and water-cooled endurance, negated the advantage of numbers. A crew of 3 men operating a single heavy machine gun could effectively pin down and control a panic-stricken regiment of hundreds. The Soviet military machine had industrialized fear, turning the most devastating defensive weapon of the First World War into a tool for domestic compliance during the Second. The barrier detachments did not just shoot men, they mathematically extinguished the biological instinct to flee. Now, I want you to close your eyes and imagine the ultimate nightmare scenario on the Eastern Front. You are caught in the crossfire, trapped in the most brutal geometry of war ever conceived. In front of you, the German war machine is advancing. You can hear the tracks of the panzer tanks crushing the frozen earth, accompanied by the systematic, tearing sound of the MG-34 and the terrifying shriek of incoming artillery shells. The air is thick with cordite, pulverized dirt, and the metallic stench of blood. Your unit has been shattered. The man next to you, the one who was supposed to share his ammunition, is dead. You have no weapon. Your officers are either dead or have lost all control. The primal, undeniable instinct of human survival takes over your entire nervous system. You turn around. You start to run back towards the safety of the rear trenches, back towards the motherland. You are not alone. Hundreds of terrified, exhausted men are running with you, discarding their heavy winter coats and useless empty ammunition pouches to move faster. You think you are escaping the slaughter, but as you crest a small ridge, looking for the safety of your own lines, you hear a sound that freezes the blood in your veins. It is not the rapid, high-pitched tear of the German guns. It is a deep, rhythmic, thumping cadence. It is the sound of the Maxim M1910 heavy machine gun, echoing across the steppes. It is the mechanical heartbeat of Order 227. Suddenly, the grey horizon behind you erupts in flashes of muzzle fire. The barrier troops have opened up. They are positioned perfectly, their water-cooled guns interlocking in a flawless grid of overlapping fire. But they are not aiming directly at your chest. Not yet. The Soviet gunners are firing sustained bursts just 3 feet over the heads of the retreating mob. The sky is suddenly illuminated by brilliant, burning red tracer rounds. Every 5th bullet in the canvas belt is a tracer, drawing a glowing, lethal boundary line in the air. The sound is deafening. The sheer kinetic energy of the heavy 7.62mm rounds cracking through the freezing air above you is a physical pressure against your eardrums. The message is unmistakable, written in fire and steel. Not a single step back. The tracer fire forms a ceiling of absolute terror. If you stand up straight, you die. If you continue running forward into this designated kill box, the gunners will simply lower their trajectory by 1 degree, and the entire retreating battalion will be mathematically erased from existence. You are trapped between 2 walls of industrialized slaughter. The psychological weight of this moment is incomprehensible. The realization that the most concentrated, lethal, and sustained firepower on the entire battlefield is currently pointed at your back, operated by your own countrymen, shatters the panic that made you run in the first place. You dive into the freezing mud. The men around you fall to the ground, weeping, screaming, digging their fingers into the frozen dirt. The panic has been broken, not by courage, but by an overwhelming mechanized terror that completely dwarfed the fear of the enemy. This is where we must deconstruct the legend and separate the Hollywood myth from the cold, statistical reality of history. The popular narrative often focuses on the executions, the idea of barrier troops mindlessly mowing down thousands of their own men in a frenzy of friendly fire. Did executions happen? Yes, absolutely. The Soviet military tribunals and the barrier detachments were ruthlessly efficient, but the true, horrifying genius of the barrier troops and their Maxim guns was not mass extermination of their own forces. It was mass psychological deterrence. The Soviet High Command understood that bullets were precious, but fear was infinite. By deploying these heavy machine guns at critical choke points, they created a system of mechanical detention. The statistics from the Soviet archives reveal a much darker, more complex truth. Between August and October of 1942, during the height of the Stalingrad campaign, the barrier detachments intercepted and detained over 140,000 retreating soldiers. Of those 140,000 men, fewer than 4,000 were executed. The vast majority, over 130,000 men, were reorganized, heavily disciplined, and forced straight back into the frontline trenches, or sent to the infamous penal battalions, the Strafbat, where they would be given the most dangerous, suicidal missions imaginable to atone for their cowardice with their blood. The Maxim guns rarely had to fire into the crowds because the mechanical threat alone was enough. The sheer thermodynamic endurance of the water-cooled barrel, the terrifying acoustic signature, and the glowing tracer rounds created an invisible wall that welded a crumbling, panicked army back together through sheer, unadulterated terror. The myth of 2 men and 1 gun is a simplification that completely misses the point. The Soviet Union did not throw unarmed men at the enemy because they lacked the industrial capacity to build rifles. They did it because their logistical network had collapsed, and when those unarmed, terrified men naturally tried to run, the state unleashed a weaponized system of internal suppression to stop them. The real dark truth of the Soviet military machine was its ability to industrialize fear. using heavy, sustained fire engineering to conquer the biological instinct of survival. It was a brutal calculus where human lives were merely the friction in a massive mechanical equation. History is rarely as simple as a man picking up a dropped rifle in the snow. It is usually much darker, far more mechanized, and driven by cold, ruthless logic. The Eastern Front was the ultimate testing ground for this logic, a place where human psychology was bent and broken by the sheer weight of industrial warfare. Thank you for diving into the abyss with us today. Next week, we are going to flip the perspective and dissect the psychological terror weapon used by the Nazi regime to shatter the minds of those very same Soviet defenders. We will tear apart the aerodynamics and the acoustic engineering of the screaming Jericho trumpets attached to the Stuka dive bomber. You will not want to miss the anatomy of the sky siren.